Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this short webinar. It should be about 35 minutes and around this idea of the future of HR. Those of you who are here at that time know there's a live chat feed that's going on where you can talk to me. And for the rest of the time, of course, this is recorded. So for other people, you can watch this at any time and don't use the live chat at that time because obviously it won't be live. There will be, for those people that want it, a copy of this webinar sent, and later on we'll talk about a tool. So if you stay further on into the webinar, you'll see an idea of the sort of tool that we create value around or do audit around for HR, and you can use that to think about for yourself. So let's make a start. This is the plan for today. We're going to talk about the future of HR, and because we're going to talk about HR, it's important to just talk a little bit about our credibility, a bit about me and the organisation I work for, the sort of challenges and issues and opportunities that face HR and what can be done about it. And it's important to say that I'm a real fan of HR. I've worked in and around the function for many years, as well as being an operational line manager, consultant and entrepreneur. And it's important that I stress at this early stage, it's critical friend time, because my view is to come at this subject from proving the value of HR, proving the value of L&D, and that's a lot of the focus of the work we do. We go into organisations, we evaluate, and we help organisations prove their value, particularly around HR, the function, L&D, the function, and the outputs that they create. So I come at this from a practitioner, from someone who's interested in the function and how it works. The organisation I work for, QED, is all about performance, and we have toolkits and case studies of growth. I'm sure lots of people will say that. And of course, you have a vested interest in being able to help you more. We work online, we work with facilitation of groups, and often a lot of HR and executive coaching. And I can often be found sitting in cloistered rooms with people, challenging and coaching and helping to get the most senior people in HR to add value. And looking at their careers as well. So it's important to know that my first career was in music, actually. So I'm very familiar with the idea of performance and proof, and went into marketing, became a line manager and a CEO. I was a CEO of a law firm, but also of a very large HR consultancy. And that's where I first became interested in the idea. Became interested in the idea of behavioural change, of course, and became a psychologist, and then eventually went to evaluation. This idea that it would be important to take the marketing metrics I understood, the operational expertise I had, and this idea of understanding psychology in people to make sure that the function that seemed to be representing those people was as fit and effective as it could be. And I know many HR practitioners, and I know that when HR practitioners are good, they're awesome. So there's some real excitement we can have. And many people know us because, of course, we developed quite a novel and new approach to evaluation. The idea of taking the old constructs, the old ideas of summative evaluation, chucking them away and coming up with an evaluation strategy, but also then a series of tools and interventions to help you prove the value of L&D. And of course, working in L&D means we've inevitably reversed back into HR as well, because one begats the other. And so, so we've obviously applied some of our approaches into HR as well. So, three thoughts to start off with. I mean, 20 years ago, I was doing my MBA in this subject, the future of HR, and the HR directors and managers at the time who had recently become HR directors, but had previously been personnel managers and personnel directors, who were wrestling with this idea of what is HR, what's it all about, where's this credibility coming from, how do we make it work, how do we get taken seriously, where do we get budgets from, should we have a seat on the board? And really, where are we going? And it is quite interesting now, having finished a doctorate, to see how the issues are similar. And a second thought, quite recent thought, coming from a conference I attended a couple of years ago, was this idea that performance management processes and systems have little or no impact on performance. And that was a concern because of this sort of pit prop of performance, which sits at the heart of HR, this idea of appraisal and review and performance management and objective setting and management by objectives, and this whole idea, if this is a poor result, again, what's HR for? And the trouble is that 93% of performance management process systems have little to no impact on performance. And this is an interesting piece of research, which regrettably the CIPD had to validate as well, and have talked a lot about this idea of how do we do performance stuff differently. And, if we're losing this, and it's becoming common knowledge, this idea, if HR are losing this plank that always given the sort of core process to allow them to talk about performance and issues wider than sort of legal and regulatory, that's an issue. And it's also become an issue for me talking to HR directors about how much they spend on evaluation of their own impact and their own development. And it's actually a distressingly low number. Often that's because of budgetary problems, but it's also about the way the budget's managed and this idea that HR often don't understand the ROI of their own budget, which is something we need to get a grip of. Because actually, if we're going to move forward together as a sort of a more coordinated unit, we've got to build the case for doing so. Now, many of you will know that in the past, HR was called personnel, and it was split into personnel, training, and OD, or organizational development. Those functions often reported into different parts of the organization. And personnel directors became the sort of supremos when Dave Ulrich put those three functions together and created these four roles. He talked about there being a consultant role, which was about HR, the new HR function, helping the organization at a wider level, being about change. The idea of helping the organization at an HR level by having business partners who worked with line managers to skill them up, but also to ensure that there was a source of supply and link to the service delivery side. And those two ideas are admin, where contracts, for example, recruitment services and such like were managed from, and then welfare. And what was interesting about this is that specific roles around ER and reward were subsumed within these sort of more generalist areas. And one of the challenges there, of course, became that, well, where does this area of expertise sit now? Where is our specialist reward person if we've got business partners? And sometimes they then became called consultants. So the consultant role lost its focus on OD and became more about the sort of specialist HR practices. So the business partner lost their focus, first of all, and partly that's because of level. The problem is, of course, that if you have an HR director who's not as senior as they could be, maybe reporting to finance, actually by the time you get to the HR business partner, the role is actually relatively mid-management. And one of the challenges there is who works, which level do they work at? And therefore, if they're at a more junior level, what level of advice can they give? And in fact, a lot of times the HR business partner becomes known for the use of the word no, rather than the use of the word, well, this is how to. Now, I understand that different HR departments work in different ways. The roles are different. The scale is different. Retail HR is very different to HR manufacturing. HR manufacturing is so different to HR services, blah, blah, blah. I understand. But what's interesting is this lack of consistency across the piece, because consistency can help us. And the CIP doesn't help because the CIPD makes the business partner a junior role. But originally it was meant to be as senior as the HR director. In fact, the HR director was seen as the HR business partner of the top team, and that's how it was meant to work. And that was one of the challenges from the original model, because of course the HR director was actually seen to be more senior, to be able to be the supremo in all those four areas, stitching those sort of four areas together. Now, one of the challenges in admin has been actually the factory. So we've got LMSs for L&D. We've got other software that allows us to do admin, payroll and such like. In fact, often payroll sits in finance. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And one of the age-old challenges here, of course, has been this idea that HR does the payroll, but they very rarely know how many people work in the organisation. And it is quite an interesting problem, and we know in HR that is an interesting problem in itself, but it's one of the issues in terms of credibility that can leap out. Welfare, well-being is interesting because welfare sort of disappeared into Wocky Health and maybe some EAP suppliers. And already we're starting to see the flavour of this supplier management piece, because a lot of HR became outsourced quite quickly. And, are HR the best supplier managers in the world? And I think recently this area is being rejuvenated with the idea of well-being. And the problem here is, of course, well-being is meant to be a strategic intervention, but it's become part of the service delivery chain. And as I said earlier, ER, recruitment, outsourcing, redundancy, replacement, all these things have been part of the HR service delivery role and have ended up being the consultant area. So if you want a specialist to talk to you about reward or executive compensation, you'll either go outside or you'll talk to the internal people who actually can give you some advice. But HR are no longer experts in business and the corporate world. They've become experts in HR. And what's interesting there, they've sort of replicated the model that exists in finance. But what's also interesting there is you'll often find that finance are welcome at the table at any meeting, but not, HR aren't always, because they're not always seen as credible or having a credibility that comes from the same place as that finance do. That's a shame. Sometimes, of course, what happens in HR is that become very fad-driven because they're linking to the external world, a part of understanding what's going on, learning into the outside world, but they're not very good often at bringing those things in and don't often have the clout or the charisma to be able to make those challenges happen. And that's an issue. And often, the source of the problem is the budget, the actual HR budget, where it comes from, how it's sourced, how it's developed. And there's a zero-sum game in budgeting. But actually, what happens is HR budget's often seen as a gift from the organisation. As one L&D person said to me, the L&D budget is the tax that the organisation pays to the L&D department. And I think it's an issue here, how the budget works and making sure that there's value seen to be derived from the HR budget is part of the way of moving forward here. And the other thing, of course, is actual performance. If recruitment is poor, if the service delivery option is not helpful, if the business partners aren't actually doing what they need to do at a senior enough level, what happens is that the performance or the SLAs that exist within this sort of function and between the function and the rest of the organisation can lose legitimacy. So when it comes to giving high value or strategic advice, the sort of functional credibility can be undermined, which is a problem. And I think this service mindset gets in the way. This idea of having SLAs between the service aspects of HR and the rest of the organisation can be a problem culturally, because of course you get this, and I don't mean this to sound abusive, but a sort of master-slave relationship if we're not careful. And if we're going to give or recapture some of the key roles and the right to hold those key roles, it's important that if you're delivering a service, it's either seen as being different, branded differently, or it works, and that will always be good. And so the idea of credibility now, where does it come from? So if it's not coming from the service mindset, if it's not coming from the idea of added value, which a lot of people have wrestled with and still don't know how to do, it tends to come from this idea that HR holds secrets. There's the aspect of confidentiality, which is why people are often nervous when people from HR pitch up and go into meetings, because they know where the skeletons are kept. And again, we have to get away from this idea that secrecy and confidentiality creates a barrier or an issue within the organisation. So it's, or we have to say, well, actually, that's going to be the source of our power. It's going to be the source of our credibility, and let's trade on that. It all comes back to what is HR for and how you want to be perceived. And one of the things I've noticed is that we've gone through 3 major transformations, and HRM was the first one, skilling the function to allow HR to become more strategic. That sort of not really works. Agile was the next thing. How do we build agile organizations, agile frameworks, agile HR, bringing in this idea of computerization and technology. And that's been great for the people who provide computerization and technology. Not so sure how it's worked for HR. And I was in an organization the other day, and basically they were saying, we don't have HR anymore, we don't need it. They're a pharma company, and that allowed them to have an in-house legal counsel, so employee law was covered. They skilled their managers up, so key practices, HR processes, recruitment, performance, all that sort of stuff, were being handled by managers. There was no performance management system in a conventional sense. There was none of the paper filling, none of the form filling, gone. L&D was supplied and sorted at a team level. HR had gone. And I thought that was really quite telling. And I'm not agreeing with it. In fact, I was quite appalled to find it. But it is often quite simple to get rid of HR with a bit of determination. And often you'll discover that HR appears in smaller companies, particularly in IT, as they grow really quickly, because HR's function is seen as necessary, because the HR line produces services valuable to the organisation. And it seems to be that in the most enormous companies, that's true as well, because obviously there's enough people in the function to really give it some gravitas, and it's been around long enough to make sure that its role's been defined. It's sort of the mid-sector where it's most challenging, where it's not big enough to be all things to all men, or it's just big enough to be all things to all men, and therefore not good enough in any of those sectors. So when I talk to HR people, they're often the people who are sitting, gritting their teeth and jumping up and down saying, this is not working for us, what's going on here? And one of the biggest challenges here in HR transformation is the time it takes to transform HR. I mean, an area that spends a lot of time purporting to be working in change management is often very poor at normal operational line management. As one HR director said to me, I have more grievances coming out of HR than the rest of the organisation put together. And this is often the case, that HR directors sort of report the lack of resilience in HR people, this idea of going through a professional line, going through professional development in one stovepipe of the organisation, HR, which seems to sort of reduce people's resilience and ability to really get grips with the wider operational issues. So I think, I was also talking to an organisation who were transforming a small HR team. I mean, I thought it was small, 20, 27 people. It was taking them 2 years. 2 years. And a normal change management process would be looking at 20 people changing, not a fundamental thing, just a slight restructure and 2 new roles. I mean, that's a 2 or 3 month job, not 2 years. So I think there's some expectations in HR which have somehow got lost. And I think we have to be greater personal transformation, HR transformation, and build a resilience to do that. And that allows us to earn the right to go and talk to the organisation about these wider sorts of areas. And I say on a regular basis, all these threats. I mean, IT is a massive threat to HR. Often they hold the keys to the factory. And in some HR teams, they hand the keys over and say, you crack on with that. We're going to do some of the value-added services, the sort of consultancy side of it, the commissioning of services and such like. Legal can be, of course, because external, internal legal houses have many of the solutions that HR have. In fact, often it's HR who are going to those legal houses because they don't have the expertise. Now, I work in an organisation at the moment where they have HR, change management, and transformation practices all working. And all three of them talk to each other. And all three of them step on each other's toes. None of them really know what they're about. And fundamentally, all go to HR to know what they're not allowed to do. We just need to make sure we've consulted with HR, because we make sure that we haven't made any mistakes, seems to be their point. We'll take the glory. HR are there to sort of be the backstop. And that's an awful place to be in. And for HR to have lost this idea of transformation HR and change management in the organisation is a real issue for us. But you'll often find that a CEO is much more comfortable with an external change management transformation provider than they are with the internal people. And that does say something about credibility and skills. And of course, these are the things that are interesting. I think one of the key threats that comes from non-execs, and one of the key opportunities, is this idea that HR are part of the prevailing culture. And you've got organisations which are doing very unethical things in terms of practice, in terms of business process, in terms of customer service. And HR are part of that. They're complicit, rather than standing back and actually having the power and authority to take that the high ground from a certain perspective, and maybe be liaising with non-execs and having that matrix reporting thing that allows them to have an agenda around which to talk to the line managers. And of course, external consultants are often ex-HR directors and practitioners who've left and become competition as well. And of course, the outsourcers, along with the IT department, can be threats. So when it's good, it's very, very good. There's no doubt about these things. All these other players in the organisation can be managed well, and value can be added significantly amongst peers and reports. But the problem is when HR aren't secure enough, aren't well enough embedded, and aren't adding enough value. These can be real problems. And the first question you have to ask yourself is, what are you here for? And a lot of people sort of say, well, we're here to mitigate the risk of the organisation. Some people say, well, we're here to deliver services. Some people say we're here to add some value, but we don't know how. And some people just say we're here to basically offer the service thing. Some people say it's expertise. Very rarely do people say, well, we're here to actually make the organisation perform better. We're here to generate more revenue and more profit. And you are. And that's not by just managing down costs. That's by seeing your role as being somehow part of the revenue upside story, because that gives you a real interesting place to work from. Now, I was talking to a senior L&D person the other day about getting information from the organisation about the upside world, because they're generating development that allows for upside generation. And by that, I mean revenue generation. And they didn't have the clout to be able to go and ask that person the key issues which were involved in the resourcing and the running pay process. bonus processes. Well, what's that about? You've got to have this idea that you're an expert at something, and that gives you legitimacy because you're good at something. And if you're going to be expert at something and you're going to be in HR, for goodness sake, be expert in HR. And one of the things you've got to be good at is influencing, communication, and you've got to be great at consulting and asking difficult questions. So let's think about the pit props that will help us in the future. There's no doubt that consumer behavior and technology are big applications and drivers for us. So in terms of HR practice and in terms of HR opportunity with behavioral change externally within the organizations, there's that rise of social VR, bots, various bits of technology are going to transform organizations in the mid to long term. And we're already seeing it arriving, because social is already here. AR's AR's around the corner, and VR's just down the road. VR's virtual reality, of course. And it's really important that HR are up to speed with this sort of technology. And in fact, it's interesting, this new HR role as guardians and innovators means, well, actually, we should be looking after the organization from the sort of technology that's coming around the corner, making sure that Facebook profiles are appropriate and such like. But we also should be innovating and using technology more skillfully. And of course, there's lots of interesting drivers from this, because of course, lots of IT companies want to sell you things which allow you to do these things better. And there's no problem with that. But we should also be talking about governance and culture, really, a lot more. Governance is about making sure that good governance exists and that the organization performs ethically. It makes money, of course, but it should be ethical, because social governance is going to be a key feature of in trends moving forward, because as the link between organizational transparency and consumers becomes ever more transparent, governance becomes much more of an issue. So leadership skills, management practice, leadership practice is really important. And therefore you should be red hot at evaluation. You've got to know what you're delivering. You've got to know that you're evaluating yourself and you're against governance and culture. And for goodness sake, if you can't measure culture by now, knowing all the tools and techniques and resources which exist out there, then it's time to find them. And I know a good-looking consultant that can help you with that, just as a sort of side note. In terms of performance, we need to get back into that sphere as well. So rethinking performance management, understand the psychology of behavioural performance and the new neuroscience aspects of this. We need to be red-hot evaluation, I think I've said that all, and we need to offer perspective. An HR department sees big issues across the organisation, and therefore surely should be bringing those things to light when they're working with teams, when they're working in specific silo areas, bringing best practice from the organisation into a silo, bringing external perspective into the organisation as part of what earns HR the right to sit at that table. But if you're not an expert in performance and all you're doing is supplying, this reason why Fred can't do what they're doing because it might upset Jane, then you've got to think about that. And of course, you must be, HR have great expertise in supplier management, and the rest of the organisation often don't. And I wonder how much that expertise is really shared around. That doesn't mean it couldn't be better, but actually it's pretty interesting. And we need to get back to this idea that HR manage careers around the organisation. That is, that the reason for being in the organisation is because there's a point to it. And who looks after someone's careers, puts the PDPs together and makes sure that there's a start and an end point to people's journey with any organisation. And we need to see HR as also being in non-HR and entitled to talk about those non-HR solutions. I went to a retail HR team recently, and they were really clear that no one HR had a professional HR background. Everybody had worked on the line. The last HR director had been one of the retail directors, and they were the most commercial HR department I'd come across, and they were adding tremendous value without even noticing it. Were invited to every single top table meeting because everybody knew everything about the organisation. They could comment on a retail footfall issue in HR as credibly as could finance or marketing or any other part of the organisation. So we need to get back to this idea of organisational development, this idea of change management, performance and change across the wider organisation. You can see I'm a fan of OD. So it's time to go on the offensive, but with some proof. It's time to get the numbers sorted out. And it's time to talk corporate speak, not HR speak. I think this is really interesting, and L&D are perhaps one of the worst bits, but there's a lot of jargon floating around that people really don't get the hang of. And it's time to use business processes that the rest of the organisation understand as well. Very few people in in HR are really great with metrics, analytics, reporting, understand some of the key measurement and management processes and metrics which exist. And you have to know your numbers, time versus impact. Where do you spend your time? Where do you get the most impact from? Simple tools, which most managers know. They come from MBAs, which often HR don't have. It'd be interesting to do a survey on just how many HR directors have MBAs. I'm not saying MBAs are the greatest thing that you need to have, but it is something that helps you understand the commercial world. So again, what are you for? And in my world, I think the biggest change is going to come from, rejuvenating this idea about OD. And if we think about roles, I thought about it this way around, and we talk to organisations about how you do this. You've got to do your process and service delivery stuff. You've got to be great at it. You've got to do the regulatory and legal stuff, compliance, keep the organisation safe. But what you've got to also do is widen your idea out of HR performance and change into organisational performance and change and in organisational innovation. What are you bringing that's new that the organisation hasn't heard about before? Where are your sources of entrepreneurial growth and drive and vigour which coming from? How is HR processing that through its service delivery arms? How are you operationalising talent management to be a useful process rather than just something that people talk about without any ideas? How do we take engagement and talk about that as being part of organisational innovation? It is, but no longer, because it's just become part of the process and service delivery teams. Let's go back and refocus ourselves based on this idea of the wider world and the organisation. We're there for the organisation, not ourselves. So we use this very simple audit tool to help us. And as you say, there's a lot about adding value because people talk about it but still don't know about it. People don't talk about functional ROI. I've talked to people about competencies. How do your competencies add value to the organisation? Well, we do. In fact, they're pretty terrible, actually. Oh, great. Does that still run your performance management system? Oh, yes. Is that still at the heart of recruitment? Yes, but we ignore them. Or we've got an 87,000-page document that no one ever reads. So one of our key things here is to start looking at functional impact. How do we actually prove the value of what we're doing? Effectiveness is relatively straightforward. Innovation audits, talking about the sort of model we looked at on the last slide, I think innovation becomes important. Disaggregated operational impact, across the board, do we hit our SLAs? But do we do more than that? Does that allow us to add value and advice? Are we too fad-driven? I walk into organisations and director of people, director of culture, but still operating the same process underneath. It's all very well being fad-driven. You've got to turn that into action. You've got to turn that into credibility. Are you bringing things in? And are you a stop or start culture? Do people come to you to stop you doing things? We need to talk to HR because it's the last point, the last people we consult with, because they'll always make it slower. So how do you make decisions? How do you help people? How do your decisions move the organisation forward rather than slow it down? Oh yeah, we have to go to HR because they'll no doubt insist on a 3-month consultation process. And then they go to the HR, and a good HR director say, no, you can do this in 2 weeks. Why are you waiting? Because that's the key. And if we're going to add value, let's have a value-added measure. Tons exist. Let's crack on and get them in. Which means that we've got to be strategic and we have to think about metrics and analytics. And if we're running around too busy faffing around in the factory, we'll never be strategic. And yet we criticise leaders for not doing that. But our good senior HR business partners, consultants, and HR directors, are they great leaders themselves, or are they no more than just functional managers? So here are the key differentiators I see. I think we've summarises really what we're doing. So expertise through implementation, not just advice. Advice is earned through implementation, not the other way around. If you're a great line manager, you'll have proven your worth in the wider organisation, not just in your own team. We know that in HR because we're constantly assessing people against that, but we don't do it in HR for ourselves. It's time perhaps for us to step up to that. The same standards around which we hold other leaders. So some key questions. Pressure for change. What's going on inside of your organisation and what's coming at you? How much is your ambition there in your department, in your function? What are the targets that we have to deliver? Not just KPIs, but targets. Sales don't run themselves on a bunch of very floppy KPIs. Why should HR? Why don't you hold yourself to the same standards that you hold the rest of the organisation? And are we influential enough to scale other leaders in the organisation by operating at that same sort of level? And as a team, do we have sufficient resilience? And as individuals, who has sufficient resilience? And who can help? And there are lots of practitioners out there, tons of HR practitioners, but we come at this from the point of metrics and proof and analytics and credibility and putting grit into your process. Yes, you need to be supportive. Yes, you need to be have a balance between management leadership focus and people focus, because actually you're there to make sure that people's welfare and resilience and health and well-being is improved, but not because it's fluffy, not because it's nice, because it actually matters to both organizations' absence rates and critically to performance. So a little bit about us. We can help you, we can come in, we can audit, we can work with your critical friend. We do evaluation around L&D and HR. We've written books, we have courses, we have coaching. Talk to us. We're very happy, we don't bite, and we'd love to add some value for you. There's been some questions running on the live chat, and some people have been emailing me already. If you have emailed me at russell@qedod.com, I shall respond, and hopefully we should be able to have a gossip with you further on. If you want a copy of the slides, please don't hesitate to contact us after this presentation. I'll just go to qedod.com, and we'd be very happy to talk to you. Hopefully this webinar has given you a perspective. It's been my own opinion, and